Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This is not simply a story about a plant. This is not merely a tale of leaves and smoke, of laws and laboratories. No. What you are about to hear is the story of humanity's oldest and most complicated relationship with a single species of vegetation. A relationship that spans 12,000 years, touches every continent, and has shaped the fates of empires, the fortunes of nations, and the lives of hundreds of millions of ordinary people. This is the story of cannabis, of marijuana, of hemp and hashish. It is the story of how a wild weed growing on the steppes of Central Asia became the most controversial, most debated plant in human history. How it was worshipped as sacred medicine by ancient civilizations, then demonized as devil's weed by modern governments. How it filled the sails of ships that conquered oceans, then filled the prison cells of men and women whose only crime was possession. How it healed the suffering of the dying, then destroyed the futures of the young. More people have been arrested for marijuana than for any other drug in history. More than murder, more than robbery, more than all violent crimes combined. Millions of human beings have seen their lives derailed, their families shattered, their opportunities stolen, all because of this single plant. And yet, today, that same plant is sold legally in sleek dispensaries, prescribed by doctors, celebrated by investors, and consumed by grandmothers for their arthritis. How did we get here? How did humanity's relationship with cannabis become so tangled, so contradictory, so deeply strange? Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue creating these deep explorations of history's most fascinating and troubling subjects. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from tonight and what time it is there. I find comfort in knowing that across the world, in different time zones and different circumstances, people are listening together in the quiet hours. Now, phone away, distractions silenced, the world outside can wait. Tonight, we journey back through millennia, across continents, through triumph and tragedy, to understand how a simple plant became the world's most wanted drug. Let us begin. Our story begins in the highlands of Central Asia, in a landscape that exists today as parts of modern Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and the mountainous regions bordering China. Imagine a world before cities, before writing, before agriculture as we know it. A world where small bands of humans wandered across vast grasslands, following herds of wild animals, gathering plants for food and medicine. The year is approximately 10,000 years before the Common Era. The last ice age has recently ended, and the climate is warming, allowing new species of plants to flourish. Among these plants is a hardy, fast-growing species that thrives in the disturbed soil around human campsites. It grows where people dump their waste, where they clear land for temporary shelter, where the nitrogen-rich refuse of human habitation fertilizes the ground. The plant has distinctive leaves, arranged like the fingers of an outstretched hand. It grows quickly, sometimes reaching heights of 15 feet in a single season. Its fibers are remarkably strong, its seeds are nutritious, and certain varieties produce a sticky resin that, when consumed, alters human consciousness in profound and sometimes pleasurable ways. The first chapter of this story takes us to these earliest encounters between humans and cannabis. We cannot know exactly when or how the relationship began. No written records exist from this period, and the archaeological evidence is fragmentary. But we can piece together a likely scenario from what we know of early human societies and their relationship with plants. The first uses were almost certainly practical. The fibers of the cannabis plant are among the strongest in the natural world, and early humans would have recognized their value for making rope, cord, and eventually fabric. The seeds are rich in protein and essential fatty acids, making them a valuable food source. The plant's rapid growth and ability to thrive in poor soil would have made it an attractive crop for early agriculturalists. But at some point, in some forgotten moment of human history, someone discovered the plant's other properties. Perhaps they burned the stalks and inhaled the smoke. Perhaps they ate the resin-covered flowers. Perhaps the discovery was accidental, a byproduct of using the plant for other purposes. However it happened, humans learned that cannabis could change how they thought and felt, could induce states of relaxation and euphoria, could alter perception in ways that seemed magical or divine. Archaeological evidence suggests that cannabis was among the first plants cultivated by humans. Seeds have been found in ancient sites across Central Asia, dating back thousands of years. Rope fragments and textile impressions indicate that hemifiber was being used at least 8,000 years ago. The plant spread with human migration, traveling along the ancient trade routes that crisscrossed Asia, eventually reaching every inhabited continent. The second chapter of our ancient history takes us to China, where the earliest written records of cannabis use appear. The legendary Emperor Shen Nung, who supposedly ruled around 2700 BCE, is credited with compiling the first pharmacopoeia of Chinese medicine. Among the hundreds of herbs he catalogued was ma, the Chinese word for cannabis. Shen Nung described the plant's uses for treating rheumatism, gout, malaria, and conditions of the mind. He noted both its benefits and its dangers, warning that excessive use could cause one to see demons. Whether Shen Nung actually existed as a historical figure is uncertain. He may be entirely legendary, a mythological culture hero rather than a real person. But the text attributed to him, the Pen Sao Qing, reflects genuine Chinese medical knowledge accumulated over centuries. Cannabis was clearly an important medicine in ancient China, used for a wide range of conditions and respected for its powerful effects. Chinese physicians developed sophisticated understanding of the plant's properties. They recognized that different preparations produced different effects. Hemp seeds, which contain little of the psychoactive compound, were prescribed as a gentle laxative and nutritional supplement. The flowers, which contain much higher concentrations, were used for more serious conditions and with greater caution. The fibers continued to be valued for practical purposes, and China became the world's leading producer of hemp rope and textile. However, the recreational or spiritual use of cannabis seems to have been less prominent in ancient China than in some other cultures. Confucian values emphasized moderation, self-control, and social conformity. Intoxicating substances were viewed with some suspicion, and while cannabis was accepted as medicine, its use for pleasure or altered states of consciousness was not widely celebrated. This cultural attitude would persist in China for millennia, making the country's relationship with cannabis notably different from that of other ancient civilizations. While Chinese physicians were cataloging the medicinal properties of cannabis, a very different relationship with the plant was developing in ancient India. Here, cannabis was not merely medicine, it was sacred. The Vedas, the ancient religious texts that form the foundation of Hinduism, described cannabis as one of 5 sacred plants, a source of happiness, joy-giver, and liberator. The god Shiva, destroyer and transformer, was said to have brought cannabis down from the Himalayas as a gift to humanity. To consume the plant was to commune with the divine. The third chapter of our ancient history explores this spiritual dimension of cannabis use. In India, the plant was known by various names: bhang, ganja, and charas, each referring to different preparations with different potencies. Bhang, a drink made from ground cannabis leaves mixed with milk, spices, and sometimes almonds or rose petals, was consumed during religious festivals and continues to be used today. Ganja referred to the smoking of cannabis flowers. Charas was the pure resin, hand-collected from the plants and pressed into dark, pungent balls or sticks. Hindu holy men, known as sadhus, made cannabis central to their spiritual practice. They believed that the plant helped them meditate, that it opened the mind to divine truths, that it dissolved the boundaries between the individual self and the universal consciousness. Even today, at temples and holy sites across India, sadhus can be seen smoking chillums filled with cannabis, their bodies smeared with ash, their lives dedicated to spiritual pursuits. This religious use of cannabis created a cultural acceptance of the plant that persisted for thousands of years. While not everyone in Indian society consumed cannabis, those who did were not generally stigmatized or persecuted. The plant was woven into the fabric of religious and social life, used at weddings and festivals, given to guests as a sign of hospitality, administered to the sick as medicine. India developed one of the most complex and enduring relationships with cannabis of any society in history. But India was not the only ancient civilization where cannabis held spiritual significance. Moving westward from the Indian subcontinent, we encounter the Scythians, a nomadic people who dominated the Central Asian steppes during the first millennium BCE. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described a remarkable Scythian ritual. After burying their dead, he wrote, the Scythians would construct small tents and place red-hot stones inside. They would then throw cannabis seeds onto the stones, and the resulting smoke would fill the tent. The Scythians would inhale this smoke, howling with pleasure, in what appears to be both a purification ritual and an intoxicating experience. For many years, scholars debated whether Herodotus's account was accurate or whether he was simply repeating fanciful stories. But archaeological discoveries in the 20th century confirmed his description in remarkable detail. Excavations of Scythian burial mounds, known as kurgans, revealed the remains of the tents Herodotus described, along with bronze vessels containing charred cannabis seeds and residue. The Scythians had indeed used cannabis in precisely the manner the ancient historian recorded. The Scythians may have been responsible for spreading cannabis westward into Europe and the Middle East. As they traded and raided across vast distances, they carried the plant and its associated practices with them. By the time of the classical Greek and Roman civilizations, cannabis was known throughout the Mediterranean world, though its use seems to have been more limited than in Asia. Greek and Roman authors mention cannabis primarily as a source of fiber for rope and sail. The great navies of the ancient Mediterranean depended on hemp for their rigging, and the plant was cultivated throughout the region for this purpose. There are scattered references to the intoxicating properties of cannabis in classical literature, but recreational use does not seem to have been widespread. The Greeks and Romans had their own intoxicants, particularly wine, and cannabis never displaced alcohol in Mediterranean culture. The fourth chapter of our ancient history takes us to the Middle East and North Africa, where cannabis would develop yet another distinctive cultural role. As Islam spread across these regions in the centuries following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE, a complex relationship with intoxicating substances emerged. The Quran explicitly prohibits alcohol, and most Islamic scholars extended this prohibition to other intoxicants. But the status of cannabis remained ambiguous, debated by religious authorities for centuries. In practice, cannabis use became widespread in many parts of the Islamic world, particularly in the form of hashish, the concentrated resin of the plant. The word hashish comes from the Arabic, and legends about its origins are woven through Islamic history. One persistent story connects hashish to the Assassins, a secretive order of warriors who allegedly used the drug before carrying out their deadly missions. This legend gave rise to the English word assassin, though modern historians debate whether the connection is historically accurate. What is clear is that hashish consumption became common across the Islamic world, from Morocco to Central Asia. It was used by Sufi mystics seeking spiritual enlightenment, by poets and musicians seeking inspiration, by ordinary people seeking relaxation and escape from the hardships of daily life. Coffee houses serving hashish became social institutions in many cities, places where men gathered to smoke, drink coffee, and discuss philosophy and politics. However, this widespread use did not occur without opposition. Various Islamic rulers attempted to prohibit hashish at different times, viewing it as harmful to public morality and order. The Mamluk sultans of Egypt launched several campaigns against hashish during the 13th and 14th centuries, ordering the destruction of cannabis fields and the punishment of users. These early prohibition efforts foreshadowed the much larger campaigns that would occur in the 20th century, and they were equally unsuccessful. Hashish use continued despite official disapproval, demonstrating a pattern that would repeat throughout history, the difficulty of suppressing a substance that people desire. As we move into the medieval period, cannabis continued to spread and adapt to new cultures and circumstances. In Africa, the plant followed multiple routes of introduction. Arab traders brought it across the Sahara and down the East African coast. It reached sub-Saharan Africa relatively late compared to Asia, probably within the last 1,000 years, but it quickly became integrated into many African societies. Different groups used it in different ways, as medicine, as a social lubricant, as a component of religious rituals. The Zulu and other South African peoples developed a particularly elaborate cannabis culture, using the plant in ceremonial contexts and valuing it highly. When European colonizers arrived in later centuries, they would encounter well-established cannabis traditions among African populations, traditions that would continue despite colonial attempts at suppression. Meanwhile, in Europe, cannabis was known primarily as hemp, valued for its industrial applications rather than its psychoactive properties. Hemp fiber was essential for the maritime empires that European nations were beginning to build. Ships' rope, sails, and rigging were all made from hemp, and the demand was enormous. England, under Henry VIII, required farmers to grow hemp to support the navy. Spain, Portugal, France, and the Netherlands all cultivated hemp extensively. When European colonizers crossed the Atlantic to the Americas, they brought hemp with them. The first hemp seeds arrived in what is now Chile in 1545, and cultivation spread northward. By the early colonial period, hemp was being grown throughout North and South America. The Virginia colony required every farmer to grow hemp. George Washington cultivated it at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson grew it at Monticello. Hemp was so important to the colonial economy that it could be used to pay taxes in some jurisdictions. But here, we must draw an important distinction. The hemp grown in colonial America was primarily the variety bred for fiber, which contains very little of the psychoactive compound tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. While this hemp was botanically the same species as the cannabis smoked in India or the Middle East, it was a very different plant in terms of its effects. Colonial Americans were growing hemp for rope and cloth, not for intoxication. The recreational and medicinal use of potent cannabis varieties came to the Americas through different routes. African slaves brought knowledge of cannabis smoking to Brazil and the Caribbean. The word marijuana itself derives from Mexican Spanish, suggesting an introduction through Latin America. By the 19th century, cannabis smoking was established in various communities throughout the Americas, though it remained largely unfamiliar to the white population. But then, something changed. The world would never be the same after the transformations of the 19th century, and cannabis was swept up in these changes along with everything else. The second act of our story takes us through this era of transformation, when cannabis moved from the margins to the mainstream of Western awareness, only to be pushed back into the shadows by the forces of prohibition. The 19th century brought cannabis to the attention of Western medicine in a new and systematic way. The key figure in this development was an Irish physician named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy. Born in 1809, O'Shaughnessy was a man of remarkable energy and diverse interests. He trained as a doctor in Edinburgh, conducted pioneering research on cholera treatment, and eventually joined the British East India Company as a surgeon. It was in India that O'Shaughnessy encountered the medicinal use of cannabis. He observed Indian doctors prescribing the plant for a range of conditions, and he was impressed with what he saw. With characteristic enthusiasm, he began conducting his own experiments, testing cannabis preparations on animals and then on human patients. He found that it was effective for treating muscle spasms, rabies, cholera, and tetanus. He published his findings in 1839, introducing cannabis to the Western medical establishment. O'Shaughnessy's work sparked intense interest among European and American physicians. Here was a medicine used successfully for thousands of years in India, now available to treat the suffering patients of the industrial world. Cannabis preparations began appearing in pharmacies throughout Britain, Europe, and America. They were prescribed for pain, for insomnia, for anxiety, for migraine headaches, for menstrual cramps, for the cough of tuberculosis. Queen Victoria herself was reportedly prescribed cannabis by her personal physician to relieve menstrual discomfort. The second chapter of our transformation era reveals how cannabis became a mainstream medicine in Victorian society. Pharmaceutical companies developed standardized preparations, including tinctures, extracts, and pills. The American pharmaceutical firm Park Davis offered cannabis preparations in various forms, as did Eli Lilly, Squibb, and other major companies. Cannabis was listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the official compendium of approved medicines, from 1850 until 1942. However, cannabis had significant limitations as a medicine in this era. Unlike morphine, which had been isolated from opium and could be precisely dosed, the active compounds in cannabis had not been identified or extracted. The potency of cannabis preparations varied wildly depending on the source of the plant material, the extraction method, and the storage conditions. What worked brilliantly for one patient might have little effect on another or produce unexpectedly intense reactions. This unpredictability limited the usefulness of cannabis in medical practice. As more reliable synthetic drugs became available in the early 20th century, including aspirin and barbiturates, cannabis gradually fell out of favor among physicians. It remained in the pharmacopoeia, but it was prescribed less and less frequently. While medical interest in cannabis was waning, recreational use was growing in certain segments of American society. The third chapter of our transformation era takes us to the early 20th century, when cannabis became associated with marginalized communities and began attracting the hostile attention of authorities. In the American Southwest, Mexican immigrants brought the practice of smoking marijuana with them as they crossed the border seeking work. The border between Mexico and the United States was then largely open, and laborers moved freely in response to economic conditions. Many of these workers smoked marijuana, a practice that was legal in both countries at the time. White Americans viewed this practice with suspicion and often with outright racism. Marijuana became associated in the public mind with Mexicans, with crime, with violence. Newspapers published sensational stories about marijuana-crazed Mexicans committing terrible acts. These stories were largely fabricated or wildly exaggerated, but they shaped public perception and created pressure for prohibition. Similar dynamics played out in New Orleans and other port cities, where cannabis smoking was associated with African-American jazz musicians and the nightclub culture of the era. The music and the drug were both viewed as threats to respectable society, as corrupting influences that might spread from black communities to white youth. The racial and cultural anxieties of the era became entangled with attitudes toward cannabis, with consequences that would echo for nearly a century. The first state laws against cannabis were passed in the early 20th century, beginning with California in 1913. By 1931, 29 states had enacted prohibitions against marijuana. These laws were passed with little public attention or debate. Cannabis was not yet a major concern for most Americans, who were more focused on the era's dominant drug controversy, the prohibition of alcohol. But the end of alcohol prohibition in 1933 created new circumstances for the anti-cannabis movement. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, led by a man named Harry Jacob Anslinger, was looking for new purposes and new targets. Anslinger would become the single most important figure in the American war against marijuana, and his influence would shape policy for decades. The fourth chapter of our transformation era is dominated by this remarkable and troubling figure. Harry Anslinger was born in 1892 in Altoona, Pennsylvania, the son of a Swiss immigrant. He worked for the railroad as a young man, then moved into law enforcement, eventually joining the Treasury Department during alcohol prohibition. When the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was created in 1930, Anslinger was appointed its first commissioner, a position he would hold for an astonishing 32 years. Anslinger was a skilled bureaucrat and a master propagandist. He understood that his agency's survival depended on having enemies to fight, and when alcohol prohibition ended, he turned his attention to other drugs. While he continued to focus on heroin and cocaine, he increasingly emphasized the dangers of marijuana, which had previously received little federal attention. Anslinger's campaign against marijuana relied heavily on racism, sensationalism, and outright fabrication. He collected what he called his Gore file, a collection of newspaper clippings about violent crimes supposedly committed under the influence of marijuana. Many of these stories were dubious or entirely false, but Anslinger repeated them constantly in speeches, testimony, and press releases. He portrayed marijuana as a substance that turned users into violent maniacs, particularly when those users were black or Hispanic. These claims had no scientific basis, but they resonated with the racial fears of white America in the 1930s. Anslinger's campaign culminated in the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which effectively prohibited cannabis at the federal level. The act technically did not make marijuana illegal. Instead, it imposed a prohibitive tax and created so many bureaucratic requirements that legal use became virtually impossible. The medical profession, which had once prescribed cannabis regularly, was largely silent. The American Medical Association actually opposed the act, but its testimony was dismissed, and the bill passed with minimal debate. The passage of the Marijuana Tax Act marked a turning point in American history, though few recognized it at the time. Cannabis, which had been legal for all of human history, was now effectively criminalized. The penalties were initially modest, but they would grow dramatically harsher in the coming decades. A war had begun, and it would claim millions of casualties. What happened next would shock the world, though the shock would be slow to register. The third act of our story takes us through the decades of escalating prohibition, when marijuana became the target of increasingly aggressive enforcement, and when millions of Americans would be arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned for possessing a plant. The years following World War II brought intensified enforcement and harsher penalties. In 1951, Congress passed the Boggs Act, establishing mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, including marijuana possession. A first offense could bring 2 to 5 years in prison. A second offense meant 5 to 10 years. The Narcotic Control Act of 1956 went even further, increasing penalties and providing for the death penalty in cases involving the sale of heroin to minors. These draconian laws reflected a moral panic about drug use that gripped American society in the 1950s. Young people who smoked marijuana were portrayed as delinquents, as threats to social order, as the first step on a slippery slope to heroin addiction and criminality. The phrase gateway drug entered the vocabulary, though the scientific evidence for this concept was always weak. Harry Anslinger remained at the helm of the Bureau of Narcotics throughout this period, continuing to propagandize against marijuana with the same tactics he had used in the 1930s. But the cultural landscape was beginning to shift. The Beat Generation writers of the 1950s, including Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and William Burroughs, experimented with marijuana and other drugs, incorporating their experiences into their work. Jazz musicians continued to smoke marijuana despite the risks. A counterculture was forming in the shadows of conformist America. The first chapter of our crisis era examines how marijuana enforcement affected real lives during these years. Consider the case of Samuel Caldwell, a Denver man who became one of the first people convicted under the Marijuana Tax Act. In 1937, just weeks after the law took effect, Caldwell was arrested for selling marijuana. He was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in Leavenworth Penitentiary. He was 58 years old at the time of his arrest. He died 1 year after his release. Caldwell's case was not unusual. Across the country, people were being imprisoned for marijuana offenses that would later be considered trivial. Many were black or Mexican. Many were young. Many were poor. They were swept up in a system that viewed marijuana as a serious crime, deserving of serious punishment, and their lives were permanently altered. The enforcement of marijuana laws was never applied equally. From the beginning, Black Americans and other minorities were arrested and prosecuted at far higher rates than white Americans, even though studies consistently showed that marijuana use was roughly equal across racial groups. This disparity would persist for decades and remains one of the most troubling aspects of marijuana prohibition. While the United States was intensifying its war on marijuana, the rest of the world was being pressured to follow suit. American diplomats, under Anslinger's direction, pushed for international treaties requiring the criminalization of cannabis. The Single Convention on Narcotics Drugs, adopted by the United Nations in 1961, placed cannabis under strict international control, treating it similarly to heroin and cocaine. Countries around the world adopted prohibition laws, often under American pressure. The second chapter of our crisis era takes us into the tumultuous 1960s, when marijuana use exploded among young white Americans and became a symbol of generational conflict. The counterculture that had been gestating in the 1950s burst into the open, challenging every aspect of mainstream American society, its politics, its sexual mores, its racial hierarchy, and its drug laws. Marijuana was central to this cultural revolution. The young people who protested the Vietnam War, who marched for civil rights, who experimented with communal living and alternative spirituality, also smoked marijuana. To them, it was not a dangerous narcotic, but a sacrament, a tool for consciousness expansion, a symbol of their rejection of their parents' values. The more the authorities condemned marijuana, the more the counterculture embraced it. The numbers tell the story. In 1965, less than 5% of young adults reported having tried marijuana. By 1972, that number had risen to over 40%. Millions of Americans were breaking the law, and the government was struggling to respond. President Richard Nixon made drug enforcement a centerpiece of his administration. In 1970, Congress passed the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, which created the system of drug scheduling still in effect today. Marijuana was placed in Schedule 1, the most restrictive category, reserved for drugs with high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. This classification put marijuana in the same legal category as heroin, more restricted than cocaine or methamphetamine. Nixon also commissioned a study of marijuana by the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, known as the Schaefer Commission after its chairman, former Pennsylvania Governor Raymond Schaefer. Nixon expected the commission to confirm the dangers of marijuana and support his tough enforcement policies. Instead, the commission recommended that possession of small amounts of marijuana be decriminalized. Nixon rejected the commission's recommendations entirely. He was not interested in scientific evidence or policy analysis. His war on drugs was driven by political calculations, as would later become clear. Years after his presidency ended in disgrace, one of Nixon's domestic policy advisors, John Ehrlichman, made a stunning admission. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people, Ehrlichman said. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. How did this happen? How did a policy driven by such cynical motivations become so deeply embedded in American law and society? The answer lies in the power of institutionalized interests, the momentum of bureaucracies, and the genuine difficulty of reversing course once a war has begun. The third chapter of our crisis era follows the devastating consequences of the war on drugs as it expanded through the 1970s, 1980s, and beyond. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, passed in response to the crack cocaine panic, dramatically increased penalties for drug offenses. While the Act's most notorious provision dealt with the disparity between crack and powder cocaine sentencing, marijuana penalties were also increased. The 1980s brought the era of mass incarceration. The United States prison population, which had been relatively stable for decades, began growing exponentially. Drug offenses drove much of this growth. By 1997, the number of people incarcerated for drug crimes had increased more than tenfold compared to 1980. Many of these prisoners were serving time for marijuana-related offenses. The human stories from this period are heartbreaking. Consider the case of Alan Russell, a 24-year-old from Virginia Beach who was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison in 2004 for growing marijuana in his home. He had no prior criminal record, he was not violent, but mandatory minimum sentencing laws left the judge no discretion. Russell served his full sentence, spending a decade behind bars for cultivating a plant. Or consider Patricia Spotted Crow, a 25-year-old Oklahoma woman arrested in 2009 after selling $31 worth of marijuana to a police informant. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison.
Her children were placed in foster care. After national attention and public outcry, her sentence was eventually reduced, but she still served years behind bars while her children grew up without her. These cases were not aberrations, they were the system working as designed. Mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes laws, and aggressive enforcement policies created a machinery of punishment that consumed human lives on an industrial scale. The victims were disproportionately poor, disproportionately black and brown, disproportionately from communities that lacked the resources to fight back. Meanwhile, the stated goals of the war on drugs remained unmet. Despite billions of dollars spent on enforcement, despite millions of arrests, despite decades of propaganda, marijuana use remained widespread. Each generation of young Americans tried marijuana at roughly the same rates as the generation before. The drug was as available as ever, perhaps more so. The war had failed by every metric except one. It had successfully imprisoned enormous numbers of people. The 4th chapter of our crisis era examines how the war on marijuana affected the rest of the world. American drug policy was not merely domestic, it was aggressively exported through diplomacy, foreign aid conditions, and sometimes direct military intervention.
In Mexico, the demand for marijuana from American consumers created a massive trafficking industry. Mexican cartels, originally focused on smuggling other goods, increasingly turned to marijuana as a reliable source of income. The violence that accompanied this trade was staggering. Tens of thousands of people have died in drug-related violence in Mexico, many of them innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire between cartels and security forces. In Colombia, Jamaica, and other countries, marijuana production became a significant part of the economy, particularly in rural areas with few other opportunities. American-funded eradication programs sprayed herbicides on marijuana fields, destroying the livelihoods of farmers who saw no other way to support their families. The environmental damage was significant. The human impact was greater. And in Southeast Asia, the legacy of American drug policy was particularly bitter. The CIA had supported opium-producing warlords during the Cold War when it suited American strategic interests. Now those same regions were being targeted for eradication. The hypocrisy was not lost on the people affected. As we approach the modern era, the landscape of marijuana policy began to shift. The 4th act of our story traces this evolution, from the first tentative steps toward medical marijuana to the wave of legalization that would sweep across states and nations in the 21st century. The medical marijuana movement emerged from an unlikely source, the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s and 1990s. Patients suffering from AIDS-related wasting syndrome found that marijuana stimulated their appetite and helped them maintain weight. Patients undergoing chemotherapy for cancer found that marijuana reduced their nausea and allowed them to tolerate treatment. These were not recreational users looking for a legal excuse. They were desperately ill people seeking relief. In San Francisco, a community activist named Dennis Perrone became a leading figure in the movement. Perrone had cared for his partner, Jonathan West, as West died of AIDS, and he had seen how marijuana helped ease his suffering. Perrone opened the Cannabis Buyers Club in 1992, openly providing marijuana to AIDS patients and daring authorities to shut him down. He became the driving force behind Proposition 215, the California Compassionate Use Act of 1996. Proposition 215 was a watershed moment. For the first time, an American state had legalized marijuana for medical purposes, directly defying federal law.
The proposition passed with 56% of the vote, demonstrating significant public support for medical marijuana even in an era of continuing drug war rhetoric. The federal government responded with hostility. The Clinton administration threatened to revoke the medical licenses of doctors who recommended marijuana to patients. Federal agents raided medical marijuana dispensaries operating legally under California law. A tense standoff developed between state and federal authorities that would persist for years. But the momentum was building. Arizona passed a medical marijuana initiative the same year as California, though it was later gutted by the state legislature. Other states followed over the coming years. By 2010, 15 states and the District of Columbia had enacted medical marijuana laws of some kind. The wall of prohibition was beginning to crack. The second chapter of our modern era examines the scientific research that was slowly catching up with public policy. For decades, marijuana research had been severely hampered by its Schedule I status, which created enormous bureaucratic obstacles for any scientist wanting to study the drug. The federal government maintained a monopoly on research-grade marijuana, and approval for studies was difficult to obtain. Despite these obstacles, researchers gradually assembled a more complete picture of how marijuana works in the human body. The key breakthrough came in 1964 when Israeli chemist Raphael Mechoulam identified delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, as the primary psychoactive compound in cannabis. Mechoulam would spend the next half-century studying cannabinoids, becoming the most important figure in the scientific understanding of marijuana. In the 1990s, researchers discovered the endocannabinoid system, a network of receptors throughout the brain and body that respond to compounds produced naturally by the human body, as well as to THC and other cannabinoids from the cannabis plant. This discovery helped explain why marijuana has such wide-ranging effects, from pain relief to appetite stimulation to anxiety reduction. The human body, it turned out, was designed to respond to cannabinoid compounds. This research had profound implications. If the human body had evolved specific receptors for cannabinoid compounds, if cannabinoids were involved in regulating fundamental processes like pain, mood, and appetite, then the simplistic view of marijuana as a dangerous drug with no medical value was clearly inadequate. The Schedule I classification, which asserted that marijuana had no accepted medical use, was looking increasingly untenable.
But federal policy remained stubbornly unchanged. Marijuana remained in Schedule I despite growing evidence of its medical utility. Research remained difficult despite increasing scientific interest. The disconnect between evidence and policy became increasingly stark. The third chapter of our modern era follows the transformation of public opinion and the political response that eventually followed. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, support for marijuana legalization grew steadily. Polls that had shown overwhelming opposition to legalization began showing narrow majorities in favor. The change was driven partly by generational turnover, as older Americans who had absorbed decades of prohibition propaganda were replaced by younger Americans with more permissive attitudes. But the change was also driven by experience. Millions of Americans had tried marijuana and discovered that the horror stories they had been told were mostly false. The drug did not lead inevitably to addiction and degradation. It did not cause violence and madness. It was, for most users most of the time, a relatively mild intoxicant, with effects comparable or less severe than alcohol. The gap between propaganda and reality became impossible to ignore.
In 2012, Colorado and Washington became the first states to legalize marijuana for recreational use through voter initiatives. Oregon, Alaska, and the District of Columbia followed in 2014. The dominoes continued to fall through the late 2010s and into the 2020s. By 2023, 23 states had legalized recreational marijuana, and 38 had legalized medical use. A majority of Americans now lived in jurisdictions where marijuana was legal in some form. The international landscape was also shifting. Uruguay became the first country in the world to fully legalize marijuana in 2013 under the presidency of José Mujica, a former guerrilla fighter who had spent years in prison. Canada followed in 2018, becoming the second country and the first major economy to legalize recreational cannabis nationally. Other countries began moving toward legalization or decriminalization, though progress remained uneven. Today, we still grapple with the legacy of marijuana prohibition. The fifth act of our story examines the contemporary period, when the long war against cannabis is finally ending in many places, but when its consequences continue to reverberate. The legal marijuana industry has grown into a multi-billion-dollar business, with dispensaries operating openly in cities across America. Companies trade on stock exchanges. Investment firms pour capital into cannabis ventures. The plant that was once the most criminalized substance in the country is now the subject of business plans and marketing strategies. But this commercialization has brought its own complications. Large corporations are increasingly dominating the industry, squeezing out small operators. The people who were imprisoned for selling marijuana are watching others become millionaires selling the same product legally. The racial disparities in marijuana arrests are being replicated in marijuana business ownership, with white entrepreneurs capturing most of the market. Many jurisdictions have attempted to address these inequities through social equity programs, offering licenses and support to people from communities most affected by the war on drugs. These programs have had mixed success. The barriers to entering the legal marijuana business are significant. Licensing fees, real estate costs, regulatory compliance, and access to banking are all challenging for entrepreneurs without substantial capital. The people who suffered most from prohibition are often ill-positioned to benefit from legalization. Meanwhile, marijuana remains illegal under federal law. The Biden administration has taken some steps towards reform, including a mass pardon for federal marijuana possession offenses. But cannabis remains in Schedule I, and federal legalization appears politically difficult despite majority public support. This creates an awkward situation where businesses operating legally under state law remain technically federal criminals, unable to access normal banking services or take standard tax deductions. The scientific understanding of marijuana continues to evolve. Research into the therapeutic potential of cannabinoids has accelerated, though it remains hampered by regulatory obstacles. Studies have explored marijuana's effects on chronic pain, epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, post-traumatic stress disorder, and many other conditions. The results are promising in some areas, less clear in others. The evidence suggests that marijuana is neither the miracle medicine some advocates claim, nor the dangerous drug prohibitionists warned against. It is a complex substance with genuine medical applications and genuine risks. The risks are perhaps most concerning for adolescents. Research suggests that heavy marijuana use during adolescence, when the brain is still developing, can have lasting effects on cognitive function and may increase the risk of psychotic disorders in vulnerable individuals. These concerns are legitimate and deserve serious attention. But they also argue for regulation rather than prohibition, for an approach that can actually restrict access to young people rather than leaving the market entirely to illegal dealers.
The contemporary debates about marijuana policy reflect broader tensions in American society. Questions about individual liberty versus public health, about criminal justice and racial equity, about the proper role of government in regulating what people put in their own bodies. Marijuana has become a proxy for these larger conflicts, its meaning extending far beyond the plant itself. Recent years have brought continued change. More states have legalized, more countries have reformed their policies. The momentum seems clearly toward liberalization, though the pace and extent remain uncertain. The war on marijuana is ending, but its conclusion is not yet written. The story of marijuana is ultimately the story of human attempts to control both nature and each other. For 12,000 years, humans have cultivated this plant, valued it, feared it, celebrated it, and condemned it. We have made it sacred and made it criminal. We have used it to expand consciousness and used its prohibition to contract freedom. The cannabis plant itself has been unchanged through all of this. It continues to grow wherever conditions allow, producing the same compounds it has always produced, offering the same experiences it has always offered. The plant does not care about our laws or our moral judgments. It simply grows, as it has grown since before human civilization began. What has changed is us. Our relationship with this plant has evolved through countless cultural transformations, reflecting our deepest values and our worst fears at different moments in history. The ancient Chinese who used ma huang for medicine, the Indian sadhus who smoked ganja in pursuit of enlightenment, the Victorian doctors who prescribed cannabis tinctures, the jazz musicians who smoked in New Orleans clubs, the hippies who passed joints at Woodstock, the patients who found relief for their suffering, the prisoners who lost years of their lives for possession of this same plant, the entrepreneurs who built legal empires. All of them are part of this story. All of them tell us something about who we are. The Prohibition era now ending will be remembered as a strange and dark chapter in this long history. Future generations will struggle to understand how a plant used safely for millennia was suddenly declared so dangerous that millions of people had to be imprisoned for possessing it. They will read about Harry Anslinger and his racist propaganda with the same incredulity with which we read about witch trials and bloodletting. They will wonder how intelligent people could have believed such obvious nonsense for so long. But we should not be too quick to congratulate ourselves on our enlightenment. Every era believes it has outgrown the errors of the past, and every era proves to be making errors of its own. Perhaps we too are making mistakes that will seem obvious to those who come after. Perhaps our approach to marijuana, whether prohibition or commercialization, will be judged harshly by future generations with perspectives we cannot yet imagine. What seems clear is that the relationship between humans and cannabis will continue as long as both species exist. We will continue to cultivate this plant, to consume its products, to study its chemistry, to debate its effects. The specific forms of this relationship will change, as they have always changed, but the relationship itself endures. The night deepens around us now. The history has been told, though the story continues without us. Somewhere in the world tonight, someone is smoking marijuana for the first time, curious about this plant they have heard so much about.
Somewhere else, someone is smoking for the 1,000th time, finding in the familiar ritual a comfort that nothing else provides. Somewhere, a patient is finding relief from pain or nausea or anxiety. Somewhere, a prisoner is beginning another year behind bars for possession of this same plant. Let your thoughts slow and soften now. This history is complex and often troubling, but you need not carry its weight into your dreams. The story will continue tomorrow and the day after, long after we have stopped listening. For now, there is only the present moment, only the quiet of the night, only the gentle descent into sleep. The world outside grows still. The controversies and conflicts of the day recede into the background. Whatever you believe about marijuana, whatever your experiences with it have been, the night treats all beliefs and all experiences with the same indifferent kindness. Sleep comes for everyone, the opponents and proponents alike, the enforcers and the offenders, the sick and the well. Rest now. Let the history fade. Let the questions resolve themselves in the quiet of unconsciousness. Tomorrow will bring its own concerns, its own debates, its own chapters in this endless story. But for that is tomorrow. Tonight is for rest. Tonight is for the gentle darkness that welcomes all who seek it. The story continues. It always continues. But for now, for this night, let it continue without you. Breathe slowly. Relax deeply. Let go of the waking world. The history of marijuana is ancient and ongoing, but your part in tonight's telling is complete. Sleep now. Sleep deeply. Sleep peacefully. The morning will come soon enough, with all its complications and possibilities. But for that is hours away still. For now there is only the night, only the quiet, only the slow and gentle drift into dreams. The story continues, and so do you, but not tonight. Tonight you rest. Tomorrow the story and you will resume together. For now, sleep. For now, peace. For now, the sweet and simple silence of the night.